Bueno, thank you for being here on a day like today, and welcome all. My name is Charles Vélez Santiago. I am the director of the Instituto Latino, Caribbean, and American Studies. I also direct the Yukon Puerto Rican Studies Initiative. And I teach in political science at El Instituto. I am really excited to welcome my dear friend Sheila Vélez, who we've known each other
for 20 years, probably. But don't say that.
We met in a critical theory conference more than 2 decades ago. And then we spent a lot of time in Latin America in something called the South-North Exchange, and just collaborating in all kinds of interesting ways over the years. LACRIT, for those of you who are not familiar, is a movement that emerged in the early 1990s as a critique of critical race theory by trying to expand debates beyond simple black and white binaries to something broader, theoretical, racially, conceptually, and so on and so forth. And I was, how should I say, intrigued when early on President Trump came out and said, you know, we're going to criticize the critical race theories and the Marxists. Those are some of the enemies of the state. And when we were thinking about all the immigration issues that were, all the executive orders addressing immigration issues, and all the immigration actions taken by the Trump administration, I thought that it might be interesting to bring a critical race theory, or somebody who's in that tradition, who's also a brilliant law professor and clinician. She manages an important clinic at the University of Pittsburgh, and who has experience in making connections that sometimes lawyers don't make in interesting ways. And the goal here is to go a little bit beyond the traditional talks that we're hearing about know your rights into something more intellectually engaging. And there's no one better, or very few people that are Sheila in making those connections. I will say, Sheila, I love Sheila, but we live in two different worlds.
Yes. And we don't agree on everything. We're usually not in agreement.
But I think that's really important because it fosters a debate and then it fosters an intellectual engagement that is born out of some sort of dialectic, if you will, in my terms. But I want to encourage you to take this opportunity to think about these debates in an intellectual manner, not just your traditional reaction to what's going on there. So think about questions and engage Professor Vélez. She's the kind of professor that loves to engage students and is great with students. She also has a cold, so please.
Yes, it's okay.
But please join me in welcoming Professor Vélez. And after this, we'll enjoy a meal together. But
thank you, Charles, for the invitation and all the work that everyone and you has put to make this event happen. I'm extremely excited to be here, not only because you guys are national champions. I'm a sports person. I have another hat where I am the NCAA person, and we will never have a women's basketball team for years. It's just fact. But I'm super happy to be here and engage in this conversation. What I'm going to try to do is first talk about who are Latinos today, because I think that there is a lack of understanding of the diversity within Latinos and how much of the United States is Latinos and how we are part of everything and everywhere. And then, unfortunately for you, I'm going to start in the 19th century, because I am convinced that for us to be able to understand how we got here, right, we have to understand how has immigration law and policy been since day one, since before there was federal court engagement, federal law engagement with immigration. And then we'll talk a little bit about how law developed. There's some images that are racist, that are xenophobic. So might be triggering for some people, but I want to highlight how consistent the state has been in using those tropes to refer to immigrants since forever. So that was important to me, but that's a trigger warning for all of you. And then we'll talk about what's different about this Trump 2.0, that it's different actually from Biden, but also different from Trump 1.0. So that's like my proposal. So here we go. This is where we are. Both a dramatic increase in numbers in the Latino community demographically, but also an enormous amount of resources in suppressing that growth, and that continued growth in the Latino community. So part of the conversation that I want to have with you is it's how we got here to be both the largest group of minorities and also currently the most targeted and the most engaged, and the state the most engaged in suppressing its continued growth. So despite our long historical presence, there's a general socio-legal invisibility of Latina and Latinos in the United States. As with other traditional subordinated communities within this country, the combination of long-standing occupancy and persistent marginality has fueled an increasing number of contemporary Latina and Latino legal scholars to engage with and try to identify the contours of Latinidad, as well as questions of what is our place, space, now and in the future of this nation, which used to refer to itself until recently as the conscience of the world. Obviously not anymore. And it's interesting because, and I'm going to digress constantly, because part of the project of the Trump 2.0 administration, it's actually an attack on empathy. It's an attack on what had been sort of the core of international diplomacy in the United States. And you saw that the first thing that went its way was USAID and also the Institute for Peace. So it's consistent with this retrenchment from this concept of empathy. I also want to say that I know that Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latine are contested designations within the very communities that they seek to encompass, because they center around colonialism as a binding thread in exclusion of indigenous communities. Because when we talk about Latinos and Latin America, it's a designation that comes from being conquered by Spain. But there are indigenous communities that continue to occupy what we call Latin America, and that don't feel identified by being Latino or Latina or Latine or Latinx. These terms are an imposition of the racial taxonomy of the United States that negates the complex cultures and history of each country, as well as anglicizing the Spanish language, which is what happened with the Latinx, because X doesn't really work in Spanish. Just to name a few of the issues. Nonetheless, the Latino and Latinx designations have also been adopted by critical theories and social movements that seek to empower all of us in an intersectional way and have become an important tool to garner political gravitas. I use Latine and because Latine is not anglicized, it's in Spanish. I also consistently use Latina and Latino. You feel comfortable using whichever. There's no meta narrative of the term. I also want to highlight that Latine or Latino exists only in the context of the United States. It exists only in the context of the United States. No one outside of the United States identify themselves as Latino. We just exist within the complexities of our national, or in my case, colonial identities. I became a Latina when I moved to Pittsburgh 15 years ago. Before then, I was mainly a Puerto Rican, a Latin American, or even an American, depending on where I was and what I was doing and how convenient it was for me. So and this is something that every time I say it, I find people, oh, I didn't know that. Right. So Latino is an American invention. So today, Latinos of any race make up almost 1/5 of the US population in 2023, making it the second largest group after non-Hispanic white population. Although the Latino population continued to grow, its yearly growth of 1.8 between 2022 and 23 is a lot slightly slower than it was previous decades ago, of 2% between 2012, 2013, and 2002 and 2003. So, however, even though the growth of the Latino population has percentually slightly decreased, it's still larger than any other community in the United States. Between 2022 and 2023, the Latino population accounted for just under 71% of the overall growth of the United States population. 71% of the overall growth of the population of the United States was the Latino population. Latinos of any race grew just over 65 million, an increase of 1.16 million from the prior year. This annual increase was in sharp contrast to the 0.2% increase in the non-Latino population, whose growth was tempered by a decline among non-Latino whites. See, not only is that Latinos are growing really almost exponentially compared, it's also that the white non-Latino community, it's just not growing. It's way below replacement value, and which is like 2.1. And this is, and you have heard this indirectly or by an euphemistic way. And it seems to me, for example, Vice President J.D. Vance is a proto-natalist. It's of the school that white people have to have more children. And part of the mass deportation and the removal of Latinos, it's also anchored in this replacement theory that some white supremacists believe that Latinos are here purposefully to replace the non-white Latino population. Most of the increase is due to birth. It's not due to immigration. Around 500,000, a little under 500,000 migrants coming into the country contributed to that growth. Most of the growth, however, is tied to birth in the United States, which helps us, among other things, explain that the first day of the Trump administration, the president enacted an executive order that tried to amend the Constitution and erase birthright citizenship as it's contained in the 14th Amendment. So that's what I'm trying to do, is for us to put things together. The four largest Latino subgroups populations are Mexican, Caribbean Latinos, Central American, and South American. The Latino population is also very young. Latinos constitute 25% of children 17 and younger. And in some school districts, Latino children are the majority of the school-age children, particularly in some districts in California. And I point to Dr. Quiñones because that's her area of work. 1 out of 4 children in the US is Latino. In comparison, there are over 36 million Latino adults, constituting 15% of all adults. There are more Latinos than Latinas in the US, but the difference is small. It's about 1%. There are about 6 million Afro-Latinos adults in the United States, which make around 2% of the total population of the United States. Since 2000, the proportion of Latinas ages 25-year-old and older who have earned a high school diploma has increased, with almost 13 million Latinas now in the labor force. Female labor participation for Latinas are higher than any other women subgroup. And this I did not know. Latinos comprise the largest minority segment of the LGBTQ plus population in the United States. About 52% are women and 48% are men, which is contrary to the general population of Latinos. There were more men, but there's more LGBT that self-identify as women than men. More LGBTQ plus Latinos age 25 or older have college degrees, 22%, compared to non-LGBT Latinos, 17%. So LGBTQ plus Latinos are slightly better educated, had better educational attainment than non-LGBT. The majority are born in the US. 68% of all Latinos in the US were born in the United States. However, the number reflects a small portion of Latinos that are coming to the United States as immigrants. According to the recent Congressional Record Service report, 10%, 10.5% of Latinos are undocumented. This is the 11 million number that gets played out constantly in the news. Notably, there are at least 16 million people in mixed status families, meaning families with at least one undocumented or unauthorized person in that household. There are also childless mixed status Latino households. Thus, the rhetoric and targeting of immigrants has an impact on Latinos individually and at a deep personal level, and also impacts the communities in which they live because their family networks are continuously destabilized by the threat of deportation and increased government scrutiny. And we have been seeing this. For example, we have been seeing the family members of men that were taken to El Salvador, men that had legal authorization to stay in the United States because they had approved for asylum, they had pending asylum cases. An interesting analysis came out today, and also this is the crazy part of what we do, that everything changes every day. So it's very overwhelming trying to keep up with the pace of the shock and awe that is happening. But what we do know today that we didn't know last week is that of all the 260 plus men that were kidnapped and taken to Secot in El Salvador, only less than 10 had any criminal record that could be verified. All the other ones are allegations of membership in the Tren de Aragua, and the basis for those allegations, and we had the opportunity to get from other lawyers. They have like a checklist. They have a checklist of how to determine, and tattoos are prominent. And there were people with Real Madrid tattoos, and I think that should be a crime to be a fan of Real Madrid. Because I'm a Barcelona fan, but I don't think anyone should be sent to be kidnapped and tortured just because they're a Real Madrid fan. Are there any Real Madrid fans here? Good. So what we this is who we are, right? If I just by the numbers, we are more than that, but this is who we are by the numbers. So immigration, anyone from computer science here? There's no one from computer science here. Do you know what that is? That is a server, right? So immigration is supposed to be like a server, that it channels goods, people in and out of the country so the country can function, because immigration and customs is integral to the health of the country's economy. So that is how it's supposed to be, right? It's a flow of constant communication but this is what we have in the United States. I'm sure that works also. So how did we get here? Okay. A ver. So originally, states regulated migration. So when the United States was born as a country, there was no federal law because there was a need of more people. So migration was really encouraged. The United States as a country needed more people to more rapidly displace Native American communities in the expansion, which is interesting because when we hear about the foundational myth of the United States, what we hear is about the brave men and women with their cart and their long skirts and, like the Ingalls family or whatever it is. We don't hear about the displacement that was happening because those lands were not unoccupied. They were occupied by Native American communities. So the states regulated migration, and you could be deported from Connecticut to Pennsylvania, and it often happened. This is a group of Irish immigrants prepared for deportation. And the grounds for deportation that existed in this 19th century, they continue to exist today. So people could be deported because they were paupers. That's the term that was used then. Now it's traduced in the Immigration Act as public charge. Someone that the state would have to take care of. Lunatics, so people that had mental illness, which is still an inadmissibility ground in the United States. So if any of you have become a legal permanent resident of the United States, there's a long list of questions that you have to answer, including a medical evaluation. And in that medical evaluation, one of the things that the doctor is going to evaluate is whether you have a mental illness that makes you a threat to yourself or others. And by the way, until the 1990s, being gay was a mental illness that prevented people from immigrating to the United States. And the other ones were engaging in prostitution. There's a lot of case law by the Supreme Court of the United States interpreting when a woman that was immigrating to the United States had an intention of engaging in prostitution. But today, even today, 2025, if you plan to become a legal permanent resident because of family relationships or because of employment, one of the questions that you have to answer is, are you coming to the United States to engage in prostitution? These are like the earliest seeds of how immigration used to, until the Treaty of Guadalupe. This is it, like I'm like 10 minutes in or 20, and we're still in the 19th century, but we're gonna get to the 21st century, I promise. But the Treaty of Guadalupe is the first time that the United States government has to contend with incorporating to its larger community a large number of Latinos. Because this was Mexico before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was the treaty that put an end to the Mexican-American War, and the treaty that ceded half of the territory of Mexico to the United States, which is kind of how it is. But that territory was occupied. People lived there. Close to 100,000 Mexicans lived in those territories. And the United States needed to decide, so what are we going to do with them? And if you want to get really into it and read the congressional record, the conversation was why do we have to keep the people? We just want the land. Like, do we really need to, like, what are we going to do? Are we really going to make them citizens of the United States? We don't need that. They're so different culturally, and all the stereotypes that persist today about Mexicans in the United States, are all part of those conversations in Congress, those debates in Congress. Ultimately, close to 100,000 Mexicans were naturalized, and as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, became U.S. citizens. So this is the first large mass of incorporation of Latinos in the United States. Remember, Latinos were all over anyway. So they were people from Spanish origin in Florida, in Louisiana, but this is the first sort of large incorporation. And interestingly so, part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and I'm going to digress, but I think this is important for people to know, also said that people get to become U.S. citizens and also keep their property if they could prove that they had ownership of that property. And of course, what happened is that courts did not give validity to the way property was organized, and most people lost most of their property. So people were naturalized, but they were not allowed to keep most of their property for a large period, for most of them. And then after, the gold rush in California came. And what the United States needed to was Mexican labor. And we were having that conversation, a conversation about interest convergence. And we'll see that policies regarding the migrations, particularly of Mexicans to the United States, are always tied to what are the economic goals of the moment. And the gold rush needed laborers and allowed Mexicans to come to the United States to work in the gold mines. And the United States also entered into a treaty with China to bring Chinese laborers to California through the Burlingame Treaty. What happens is that the gold did not last. And an economic crisis ensued. And this gave rise to the first federal immigration law, which is the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act is important not only because it's the first federal immigration law that was created to exclude people. So it was not created to organize the free flow of goods and people. It was created to exclude people that already have permission to be in the United States and was unilaterally that had permission to be in the United States as per a treaty between the United States and China. And now the United States unilaterally revoked that treaty. And litigation ensued. A man called Chen Xiaoping sued, said, no, but I have a permit. And the Supreme Court said two things in the Chinese exclusion case. One, that the United States federal government had plenary power over immigration because it's inherent to sovereignty and war powers. And two, that treaties are not more important than statutes, that any treaty that the United States entered in can be changed unilaterally by statute. So that initiated the systematic exclusion of Chinese people that had authorization to come in. This is exactly what is happening right now in the United States. So this week, 900,000 people that had entered to the United States using the CBP-1 app that the government had created and directed them to use to gain entry into the United States have been unilaterally revoked. but it has happened again. It's just that we don't know that has happened before. And something similar to this moment and that moment is that policies of exclusion were extremely popular. This is an ad by the AFL, which later would be the AFL-CIO, which is the main union conglomerate in the United States, supporting Chinese exclusion. Mead versus Rice, American manhood versus a derogatory term. So there was a lack of concerted solidarity, and these were popular policies at that time. Am I depressing you too much? Because it gets a little worse. And this is part of the congressional record on the debates of the Chinese Exclusion Act and how we start seeing the coalescence of metaphors of disease and sickness to refer to immigrants that are present in the United States as a way of dehumanizing and gathering support for their exclusion. And I know you're not a fan of cartoons, but I'm a fan of cartoons. Because there was no social media, right? There was no other way of people communicating, and newspapers were an important way of communicating ideas, policies, but also propaganda, right? So now it's TikTok. That's how Javier Milei won the elections in Argentina, right? And very much why the Trump administration is going to extend TikTok and not apply the statute. And after the Chinese Exclusion Act, we are again faced with another war that brings millions of people into the fold of the United States in somewhere of another through the Spanish-American War of 1898. So Puerto Rico, Cuba, Filipinas, well, all are both in the war, the spoils of war. And the United States had not had an international imperialist endeavor until then, because the way that they saw themselves, they were just manifesting their destiny to conquer all that space that was from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But now these are different cultures, different places, the Caribbean, the Pacific. What do we do with that? It's a conversation in Congress. The conversation in Congress and the conversation in academia. Because I need to highlight that all this rhetoric that academia used to be very much neutral, and that now it's woke and it's not neutral anymore. That has never existed. That has never happened before. So the conversation was, what do we do with this? Does the Constitution follow that flag? Does it mean that now that cantaron bandera, is everyone that in those territories a citizen of the United States? Are they afforded the same constitutional rights of the amendments to the Constitution? And of course, the short answer is Professor Benedor can explain to you how citizenship to all these places developed. That's what he writes about. So what do? This is how Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, Guam were portrayed in popular culture. But they were not only portrayed like that in popular culture. This is an excerpt from the Columbia Law Review. And the Columbia, Harvard, Yale, the academics, the constitutional scholars were all writing about What does this mean now? Does the Constitution follow the flag? And this is academia in its neutrality, advocating against the incorporation of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, because they are an unwelcome fellowship, because it means the entrance of an inferior race. And later, other law reviews and then the congressional record will reflect the idea that not only they were an inferior race, a serpent in our bosom. Let us beware of those mongrels of the East with pestilence and touch of leprosy that were deemed to be forever incapable of democratic governance. And this idea was adopted by the Supreme Court of the United States in the insular cases. And when it all ended, Puerto Rico became a property of the United States, but not part of the United States. So it belongs to, but it's not a part of. And it's 2025, and the insular cases have not been revoked. So that is the law. And this is the basis for that. So it gets better. Because in 1924, the United States then adopts its first really comprehensive immigration law about who can come to the United States. That it was no longer just about excluding Chinese, but it was who can come to the United States. And that is the 1924 National Origins and Asian Exclusion Act, because the exclusion of Asians from immigrating in the United States continued until well in 20th century in the United States. And what the National Origins said is that people could immigrate to the United States in the same proportion that people already occupy the United States. So if there were more Germans can come. Because the United States, there were more British citizens can come. Because the idea of the national origins quota was to preserve the ethnic and religious integrity of the United States. And because of that, it also discouraged the immigration of Irish, Italians to the United States because they were Catholic. And there was actually a political party whose sole reason to existence was to advocate against the immigration of such. And it's interesting because now we think about Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants to the United States as like the most successful immigration to the United States, and you think of McCarthy and Giuliani. That was the first one that occurred to me as core American, right? At the core of what being American is. But the national origins quota operated from the very, very racist phrase that still is used in Europe, that Africa begins in the Pyrenees. Right? It was based on race. And there was no quota for people from Asia to migrate to the United States. There was no quota for people from Africa to migrate to the United States, from Oceania, unless you were white. So there was a formula to determine this. And if you, for example, Hong Kong was part of the British Empire, so if you were a white Briton in Hong Kong, you could travel and you can immigrate to the United States. But if you were Chinese in Hong Kong, you couldn't. So just to the colonizer, not to the colonized. No people from Japan, but if you were a non-Chinese, if you were Portuguese in Japan, because you have been there since the Portuguese went to Japan, you can probably come to the United States. And this and this anti-Asian sentiment that has been present in the immigration and policy of the United States since literally day one, it's important to be able to understand how this happened. How that consistent dehumanization and exclusion of Asian Americans in the United States allowed for people to accept concentration camps in the United States for Japanese Americans. When I saw, so I've been doing immigration law for a long time. I've been a law professor for a long time, but I've also been an immigration lawyer for a long time, and I run a clinic with my students where we represent asylum seekers and survivors of torture. So I have seen a lot, but no one comes to our office and to us because they have had a pleasurable experience in their past. Those are not my clients. But I couldn't be more but triggered when I saw the images of the Venezuelans arriving in El Salvador and being stripped of their clothes, being washed, being shaved, which was the same systematic process for concentration camps. And how that has been preceded by propaganda for years about Latinos being monsters, Latinos being criminal, the demonization of Venezuelans in general, with the excuse of the Tren de Aragua. I couldn't but think this seems too familiar. We have been here before. And let me tell you, the Korematsu case that was taken to the Supreme Court of the United States, Supreme Court of the United States validated the concentration camps in a case called Korematsu. That's why one of the leading civil rights litigation centers in the United States at the University of Seattle is called the Korematsu Center. It was not overruled until less than 50 years ago on in the Moumedien case. So that continued to be good law in this country until fairly recently. So the Supreme Court has a collection of cases of what I call cases of note and mostly shame, where through those cases, they allowed the immigration law to continue to exclude Asian Americans from citizenship in the United States, and created a whole jurisprudence of whiteness. If you read those cases, the Supreme Court said, well, there's three races, Black, there's one of them that says there's only three races that are recognized: white, Black, and Mongoloid. This is the Supreme Court of the United States. So this continued until the 1960s. And I must say that states had similar rules that were particularly anti-Asian American, because what the states did in their legislations was that they incorporated legislation that said people that are unable to naturalize, are unable to intermarriage, are unable to testify as witnesses, are unable to own property. So they used the case law from the Supreme Court that validated exclusion of Asian Americans from naturalization to create other spaces of segregation. In the post-war boom of the economy in the United States, the United States once again needed labor and created with the government of Mexico a bracero program. And millions of Mexicans came to the United States through the bracero program. However, the bracero program ended. And in the process of ending the bracero program, the United States engaged in a mass deportation effort. And it's estimated that between 1954 and 1959, more than 3 million Latinos were deported from the United States. Many of them, no one really knows how many were US citizens, because they were both deported by the federal government, but also encouraged to self-deport by state authorities. So there's no really, and it's interesting because even now in my practice, we find people whose grandparents were born in the United States, or their great-grandparents were born in the United States and had been deported to Mexico. It's like, but why? Well, they had to leave. They were told that they had to leave and they left. And in this process of being excluded, deported from the United States, they were also denied the opportunity to present evidence of their right to live in the United States, which is exactly what we are seeing today. And this continued to be the law until 1965. And then in 1955, the Immigration and Nationality Act changed substantially as a result of the Civil Rights Movement. And it created a system of immigration quotas that were no longer tied to ethnicity, but were tied to family relations and employability. So it created the system that we have now. So the law today reflects the law of 1965. The structure of immigration law in 2025, it's the structure of the immigration law that was created for the United States of 1965. And believe me, we're not the same country. Although there is a really, really concerted effort to retrogress, we're not there yet. And it really helped change the modern demographic landscape because it's allowed more people to bring family members to the United States, and it allowed for the first time people from Africa, from Philippines, and from China to bring their family members through a legal process. But all those categories are subject to quotas. Only certain amount of people can be granted visas to come to the United States. And there are more people applying for visas for their family members and getting approved to come to the United States than there are visas available. And that creates the backlog. So this is the visa bulletin for March 2025. And what that means is, so F4 is brothers and sisters of US citizens. So if you are the sister of a US citizen, you have to wait until your priority date becomes current to be able to come to the United States. So if you are from Mexico, that now in March 2025 are coming in those that were approved in March 2001. 24 years. So when people say you have to come in legally and get on the back of the line, this is the back of the line. So I think family members of sorry, no, the other way around. So F2A are spouses. I think they're spouses of legal permanent residents. Those are the ones that are closest to being current, and that they have to wait 3 years. But everybody else. And why do they have to wait 3 years? What happens is that if you're a legal permanent resident, you in 5 years you can become a US citizen. So if you naturalize, you move from category and you move to this category or to this category, depending on your bringing. So this category gets these categories get crowded, and this one, it's more fluid because more people naturalize, and people have to naturalize because only if you naturalize, you can't be deported. Only if you naturalize, you can vote and fully participate in the political life. So this is the background. There have been limited changes to immigration laws, but I wanted to, since 1965, but I want to highlight here the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1967, which is the shortest law. It has one paragraph that you'll ever see. And it only says that Cubans that are admitted or paroled to the United States can become legal permanent residents of the United States after 1 year. That is all that it says. Oh, and their family members, and their spouses, their immediate relatives. So Cubans have a privilege that no one else has ever had. Just by entering the United States, in 1 year, you become legal permanent resident. In 5 years, you're a US citizen. And that has been successful for Cubans. And when Cubans started coming to the United States, the government of the United States and the government of Florida created a comprehensive integration program where the medical school of the University of Miami created a special curriculum so Cuban doctors could become doctors in Florida. Created the American Bar Association, the Florida Bar Association created the same for lawyers that were lawyers in Cuba. And the engineers created the same for engineers. So you had a community that was helped to integrate and enter into the United States in a professional class. Nothing like that has ever happened for anyone ever, except for Cubans. And it was successful. So if we want to think about a successful way of integrating immigrants to the United States, it's been done before, right? There is a path for that. The Refugee Act of 1980 is important because until the 80s, even though the United States have been party to the convention since 1951, and then since the protocol in 1967, there had not been a refugee act that allowed people to effectively come as refugees or asylees in the United States. And in 1996, fundamental change happened in immigration law that has created part of the conditions that allowed for massive Central American migration to the United States in the 2000s. And it was the increase in deportation grounds for criminal behavior, with a particular emphasis in gang participation in violent gang crimes. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I need to highlight that while Cuban migration was happening to the United States, and in three waves, the first more political, the second the migrant vote leave, and the third the balseros, and that continues kind of similar until today. While Cuban migration was encouraged by law, that had policies to facilitate integration, had parole and refugee benefits, Haitians that were migrating at the same time and were being interdicted in the international waters at the same time, were being sent to concentration camps, repatriated with no integration policies, and parole and refugee benefits that were completely inconsistent. And that photo there, it's one of my earliest memory as a child to see a refugee. This is when I was growing, because that was in Puerto Rico. One of the army bases in Puerto Rico, the National Guard base, was turned into a concentration camp for Haitians. Do you remember that? Because you're more or less by the same age. And I remember that, and I was probably 10 years old. And I thought that is what a refugee was. Right? A refugee is someone that you put in a concentration camp and you keep away from you. Little did I know that I would end up doing what I do, but I have a distinct image that this is the first time I thought about the word refugee, and so a refugee. A a consistent theme in Latino migration in the United States is we are here because you were there. Right? So we are here because you conquered Mexico and annexed half of Mexico, and because you won the Spanish-American War and brought Filipinos, Cuba, and Cuba was granted, well, was not granted. Cubans have been fighting for the independence very successfully, and the United States agreed to the independence of Cuba because Cuba had already basically won independence from Spain when the Spanish-American War happened. There's a whole other conversation about Puerto Rico that we're not gonna have today. But the United States intervention in Central America, it's important to note because in the 1980s, large-scale migration from Central America and refugees came to the United States as a response of people leaving Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, where political opposition movements were being suppressed by authoritarian regimes with the help of the United States. And you know what the Gran Contra affair is? I don't have to explain it to you, but this is just part of that interventionism. And it is also why the Central American Triangle communities migrated to the United States in the 2000s. Because as a result of the 1996 immigration changes, thousands of gang members from gangs in California were deported to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So Barrio 18, Mara Salvatrucha, these are not Salvadorian gangs. Barrio 18, Mara Salvatrucha, these are California gangs. So you exported your gang problem to countries that had no resources to fight them at that time. And that opened the door for massive migration of Central Americans to the United States, in particularly since 2014, Central American children. Because gangs need people. So gangs kill people, they kill their rivals, so they need to repopulate, they need to get more recruits because they have power in numbers. So hundreds of thousands of Central American minors have came to the United States starting roughly in 2014 to flee forced recruitment by gangs. And what everybody has been wanting to have is a comprehensive immigration reform. It's like, okay, it doesn't work. So Democrats agree, Republicans agree, we all agree this doesn't work because there's no way you can have in 2025 or in 2000 a law from 1965 that meets your needs as a country. But that has never happened. So they have been really, really close. It has never happened. The failure of the government to act in the immigration reform gave rise to an important social movement, which is the Dreamers movement. Hundreds of thousands, and people with DACA are close to 800,000, hundreds of thousands kids that had been born outside the United States, had been brought here, they grew up, many of them did not realize that they were not US citizens until they graduated from high school and they needed to do their FAFSA and their college admissions. And they were able to mobilize, garner support, try to pass the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act did not pass in Congress, but the Obama administration adopted it through executive action. So here we see kind of a start of executive action in immigration to compensate for the lack of action in Congress. And you will see Obama, Trump 1, Biden, Trump 2 rely on executive action to try to change the immigration law and policy landscape because of the inaction by Congress. Right now, DACA is enjoined, partly enjoined. No new people can join. The people that have it can renew it because the state of Texas, my favorite state, not sued to enjoin that. I have never understood how is it possible that Texas had standing in that case, but I'm not a constitutionalist. This is an example of young men, mostly from the Central American, coming to the United States in La Bestia. That's the name of that. That's the name of that train. And then we have Trump 1.0. And what happened in 2007 was a rehearsal for Trump 2.0. Because most of the policies that you see here, I mean, starting from the travel ban, that was, I love this quote because it was a disaster, the rollout of the travel ban, that people were coming to the United States from all over the world. They realized there was a travel ban. There were hundreds of people that were flying literally inside the planes. A judge in Baltimore issued an injunction just for Maryland. So people were asked to change planes, whatever they were connecting, and everyone coming from Maryland. I remember that there was an Iranian physician that was coming to the School of Medicine at Pitt, and I was working with the chair of the department, and he got in his car and got to Baltimore to wait for him and drive him into Pittsburgh. It was crazy. There's not a travel ban right now, but they will be. We're all waiting. We already have an idea of which countries are going to be. There's like 60 countries on the list of travel ban that includes places like Afghanistan, but also places like Bhutan. Exactly. Dominica, it's on that list. Nevis, it's on that list. So that's another conversation. We can have that. But most of the policies that we see today are policies that were enacted in 2017, but they were not successful because they were too raw. They were too obviously illegal, too obviously unconstitutional, and allowed for lots of litigation. And by the time litigation was ultimately resolved, the term was over, and 4 years were over. Notable though is family separation. And I want to make a note regarding family separation because migration is family separation. So, and as the border crossing became increasingly more difficult after 1996, and more enforcement happened at the border. Before, people would come and go. There was circular migration. People would come, work in the United States, go back, come back, undocumented, leave their families at home, but now they couldn't. So you started to see families migrating together because there was no guarantee that the family member that was migrating for work was able to come back. So ended up being detained because they were migrating together in a way that it had not been happening before. It had been mostly a male working age migration, and now then it changed to a family migration. And since, like I said, since 2014, the number of children migrating alone also increased. This idea of how many people have been deported every year, and you will see that there's considerable change in the last 20 years, sort of a pretty consistent increase. I need to understand what happened in 2017 because that is not a, oh, well, I know what happened. The Biden administration had a very mixed legacy. It did undo lots of the policies from the Trump administration, but remember, COVID was, we were in the middle of COVID when the elections happened. And it was limited what the Biden administration can do because they preserved Title 42 and they preserved the closed borders for a long period of time. But it did help naturalize 3.5 million people and rebuild the refugee resettlement that had completely closed, and created the humanitarian parole programs to facilitate Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguas, and Venezuela, also United for Ukraine, and Operation Allies Welcome our Afghans. And I have to say something about this. The withdrawal from the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan happened before the Ukraine war. And Ukrainians got parole and an organized system of protection before Afghans. And there was an outcry. You can't do this. You can't give it to the white Europeans and not protect the Muslims that are at risk because they collaborated with you in your nation building efforts. So this happened because this happened. And there was a crisis at the moment. There was a large number of immigration. The CBP1 app that Biden created allowed 900,000 people to come into the United States, extended temporary protected status to 1.7 million, and expanded humanitarian parole. All these programs are being ended, except Ukraine and Afghan paroles have not been terminated. We think something is coming for the Ukrainians because Ukrainians received an email in error on Friday saying that their paroles had been terminated, and then the administration said, oh no, sorry, that was a mistake, it's not happening yet. Because the rollout of this has been very chaotic, as you know. And that leads us to Trump. And I didn't on purpose to be overwhelming, because it's overwhelming. It has been a policy of shock and awe. Many of these orders are illegal and unconstitutional, but many are not. Because what we have seen from what we've learned since the 19th century is that the government of the United States has an extraordinary amount of discretion in how it handles immigration. And the Immigration and Nationality Act gives a lot of discretion to the executive and to the attorney general and how to do this. So many of these policies are unethical and they're unconscionable, but they might not be illegal, unfortunately. What is new, what is different from Tom 2.0, and I'm 2 former minutes and we're done. The rhetoric is different. It's the challenge to the courts, the call for impeaching judges, and judges have been surveyed, and many judges are afraid for their physical integrity. They're afraid. The propaganda, the way that the propaganda for the elections have come back to be part of the official documents of the United States, like we had seen early in the 20th century and we had thought, I thought we're never going to see that again, right? But if you read the executive orders, the language of the executive orders is very violent. That is different. The continued dehumanization of immigrants to justify human rights violations, the creation of the manufacturing of a human rights crisis that didn't exist. That is also different. This invasion language to use the Alien Enemies Act. By the way, the Alien Enemies Act was what was used to justify the term concentration camps of Japanese Americans, for Japanese Americans. So it's, there is an idealization of a time that has passed and a concerted effort of retrogression to go back to somewhere like, 1951, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of the composition of the country, in terms of the role of women, in terms of the baby boom. It's it's a concerted effort to change culture again, and to change culture to make America something that it is no longer, and that it resists being. What is different? Secot, the kidnapping of people and sending people to El Salvador, that is different. The fact that last week, the press secretary said that the president is considering ways in which he can also send US citizens to that prison in El Salvador. He doesn't know how he can do it legally, but he would try to do it. That is concerning. But the most concerning thing for me, and I'm going to leave it here and open up for questions, is I'm going to do something else. It's that there's popular support for this. This goes back to that AFL-CIO ad. There is popular, so there's not popular support for tariffs. Tariffs are no go, no bueno. Americans want to mock people speaking Spanish. But this is what's keeping support. And that is what for me is most concerning. Because there was more, people are afraid. People are afraid to stand up, to challenge the policies. The lawyers that are challenging these policies are being signaled out, are being detained at the airport, are being threatened with disbarment. The same, it's happening in academia, right? So universities that challenge the status quo, international students, international scholars that seem to be critical of the government. And there's, from my perspective, not enough outcry and pushing back about this, particularly from academic institutions. So this is, for me, what is different and what it's really concerning of what is different. So now what? This is qué hacer, and this is like Lenin's qué hacer. That's a marxist joke, I'm sorry, but I can't. But there's how do I look at this from a Latino and Latina critical legal perspective in an effort to move forward and think about other ways this could be, and how do I try to explain this? It's, first of all, the centrality of race and xenophobia. Also giving context and complexity. We've been here before. This has happened. There's a history to this. There are complexities to this that are historical. And how we counter the policies with the stories of immigrants. I think it's important to understand how mixed status families are suffering. What are people living? What are the lived experience of those people that have their spouses and their children taken to El Salvador? Or of those scholars that were your transplant surgeon and all of a sudden you can't come to the United States. What are the costs of that? So we need to be able to tell those stories, and we need to be able to tell it from an interdisciplinary approach, because this is not really about law. This is about access to education. This is about health. It's about the economy. It's about well-being. So there's a complexity that's interdisciplinary. And I think that we have to be able to tell the stories and build for the future from an interdisciplinary way. And of course, a praxis of solidarity that is cross-sector, that is transnational, that is concerted, and that is very brave, because I understand that people are afraid. But if you don't, then we are back to 1951. And I, for one, I'm not doing that. Thank you.